Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third public law webinar in the 42 Bedford Row series of webinars. The private law webinar and the first two public law sessions can be found on our website and our YouTube channel. Now, I am very grateful to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Ben Laskey. He's here to discuss with me the issue of culpability in care proceedings, and in particular, the question of what the correct approach should be for practitioners where the principal reason for the proceedings starting is that the child is beyond parental control. That's going to be a key question, particularly in cases where it's also relevant to consider parental culpability. Put colloquially, who's to blame? I should introduce Ben properly. Dr. Laskey is a consultant clinical psychologist and director of the Psychological Partnership. He works for the Family Court in the Southwest and has also completed assessments as far afield as the Isle of Scilly in Jersey and Antigua and Barbuda in the Family Court there. He's been an expert witness for the past 15 years, and he provides supervision for other psychologists working in the court. He's also a local and national member of the Committee of the British Psychological Society and the British Association of Behavioural and Cognitive Psychotherapies. And he has a specific interest in working in particular with parents and parenting. He's one of the developers of clinical intervention working with parents to support young children suffering from anxiety. He's worked previously at the University of Manchester in Exeter and was the parenting lead for the city of Salford for several years. So thank you very much, Ben, for joining us. Before I turn to Dr. Laskey, the reason this seminar came about is that in the last year or so, I've been involved in 4 cases, one which is ongoing, that have occurred following the breakdown of adoption placements. In each of those cases, the adopters found that they weren't able to cope with the behaviour of the children who had been placed in their care once they'd hit puberty. And in each of the cases, the local authority was concerned that to accept a pleading that the child was beyond parental control would in effect be blaming the child for the breakdown of their placement. Furthermore, it was felt that in each case, to accept such a pleading that the child was beyond parental control would not sufficiently address the parental deficits that had led to the placement breakdown. I should say, as an aside in preparing this webinar, that great minds think alike. And I want to name check Claire Chiborowska from One Crown Office Row, who at the very end of this month has in fact just had an article published in Family Law called Beyond Parental Control, Who's to Blame? I'm also very grateful to, forgive me, I'm going to have to do the second name check at the end of the note when I get there. I want to start with the legal foundations before we go to Dr. Laskey. The fact is that we all know there's a difference between threshold and fact-finding. And Mr. Justice McFarlane, as he was then in a case called Oxfordshire County Council and DP, made the following observation. He said the Section 31 threshold is no more than a jurisdictional gateway through which courts must pass before it's empowered to make either a care or supervision order. So getting our knickers in a knot about what should and shouldn't be in threshold documents is sometimes really putting the cart before the horse. The second point is one which I take from the well-known case of the RIE from 2015, which is the threshold drafting case you'll all be fairly well aware of. Thresholds should be based on facts and inferences properly drawn from facts, and there must be a connection between the evidence that the local authority adduces and seeks to prove and the facts and the inferences that the court is invited to find. Now, the relevance of this is that where a child is beyond parental control, there is often an inference that the court is invited to find as to who's responsible. Section 31, it will be well known to everybody. It says this: the court can only make a care or supervision order if it's satisfied either that the child concerned is suffering or likely to suffer significant harm attributable to the care the child is given or likely to be given, in other words, attributable to the care of the parent, or attributable to the child being beyond parental control. We all know what the first limb requires, but the second limb, attributing a child's behavior, attributing harm to the child being beyond parental control, has not been the subject of much case law at all. Very early cases suggested that some sort of parental culpability or responsibility was needed, that there needed to be a link. In 2000, Lord Nichols, in a case called Lancashire County Council and Barlow, said this: the phrase attributable in section 31(2) connotes a causal connection between the harm or likelihood of harm on the one hand and the care or likely care of the child being beyond parental control on the other. The connection need not be that of a sole or dominant or direct cause or effect. A contributory causal connection suffices. This was considered in 2016 by Her Honour Judge Redgrave in a case called Re P. In that case, there'd been an adoption breakdown. The child was beyond parental control. And the court had to consider whether this required a causal link or whether it was sufficient for the court to be satisfied that establishing significant harm and being beyond parental control without a causal link were sufficient. And if a causal link is necessary, then at least to some extent is some blame imputed to the parents. And what Her Honour Judge Redgrave said was this. She said, in my judgment, the ordinary grammatical construction of the section requires the establishment of a causal connection by evidence, however slight. In that case, she found that the carers were, in her words, utterly blameless. They fought tirelessly, she says, for the child in their care, and in her view, proceedings should never have been issued. So she was clear that there needs to be an evidential connection with the care the parents provided. This goes against a previous authority called Re K from 2012, where His Honour Judge Bellamy found in his judgment the following. He says, this is paragraph 49, it's clear that from the explanation given that even if a child is likely to suffer significant harm as a direct result of a disorder which affects that child's behaviour, if the consequent behaviour is such that a parent is unable to control that child, then the child being beyond parental control is at the very least a contributory cause to the likelihood of future harm, the child being beyond parental control. The most recent decision is a 2017 decision from Recorder Howe QC, sitting in the High Court, where he confirms the decision of His Honour Judge Bellamy. And he also references a case called Riel from 1997, when the then president makes a number of observations, but basically says that misfeasance, so in other words, blame, is not necessary. A child is quite simply beyond parental control. It's extremely sad, she says, but it's not a case for apportioning blame. So in summary, Re P suggests there needs to be a causal link between harm suffered and this being attributable to the child being beyond parental control. Re K says it's not necessary to prove fault to achieve this second limb. And Recorder Howe sides with the case of Re K. So the law at the moment is that we do not need to attribute any form of responsibility, accountability, blame, whatever you want to call it, when finding that a child is beyond parental control. Why does this matter? Well, that's why Dr. Laskey is here to help me out today. Where a child is beyond parental control, they often show criminality, criminal exploitation, sexualized behavior, suicidal ideation, self-harming, anger, rage, withdrawal, physical abuse coming from the child, attention-seeking behaviors, running away, avoidance, substance misuse, etc. What is interesting is that in agreeing with the case of Re K, Recorder Howe quotes from the Guidance to the Children Act, Volume 1, where it says this: the second limb, i.e. beyond parental control, provides for cases where whatever the standard of care available to the child, he's not benefiting from it because of a lack of parental control. It is immaterial whether this is the fault of the parent, of the child, Such behavior frequently stems from distorted or stressed relationships between parent and child. Ben, thank you very much for joining me. Is it really immaterial whether it is the fault of the parent that the child is beyond their control?
Well, it's an interesting question, George. Can I just make a very quick correction to my bio at the beginning? You said on the national committee of the BPS and BABCP. I'm not currently on either of those committees, so that's historical. I feel that's
thank you,
an important correction in case anyone from those committees is listening. In terms of from us, I was thinking about this. I know we had a brief check-in earlier this week, and I was thinking about this kind of issue yesterday evening. And I was thinking that in a way, there's quite a difference between the kind of psychological perspective on this in terms of intervention and supporting families and the legal perspective. Because from a psychological point of view, what you tend to find is that we would tend, if we're working clinically with families, to avoid blame wherever possible, because it tends to be something that actually inhibits progress and can block effective intervention. And what we would want is to kind of move towards an understanding of the kind of, if you like, where the point that a family has come to, where they're going to be needing support, that looks at it, in a very kind of accepting way, that normally what we're looking at is everyone's doing their best, but we've come to a point where things are untenable. And if we start moving into a place of saying, well, this is your fault and this is the child's fault, and then the risk is you get disengagement by either parents or the child, and so kind of intervention becomes more and more fraught with difficulty. And then I was thinking about, I'm aware as well, we've got there are kind of different issues of, if you look, there's quite good but slightly old information on adoption breakdowns, which are probably relevant to this discussion. But I was reflecting that the cases that had triggered this kind of line of thought for you, and effectively the webinar we're having, presumably are cases where you're looking at a separation of the child from the carers, where the carers aren't coping very well. The child's beyond parental control, or at least that's being asserted, but the parents aren't at that point trying to have the child removed from their care. So I'm assuming these are contested matters, generally speaking.
What's often contested in these cases is not so much that they've lost control. In every single one of the cases I've been involved in, the adopters have had to relinquish the care of the child because it's impossible for them to do so. What's contested, hotly contested, is that the adopters are in any way responsible for the harm that these children have suffered on top of their original adverse childhood experiences. I mean, I'd probably go back and start from first principles. What do we know about the impact that the early childhood experience will have on outcomes for these children in later life?
Well, what we know is that, the more and the earlier trauma a young person is exposed to, the more devastating and the longer and darker a shadow that casts, if you like, into the child's future. And I was looking at the so it's quite hard to find data on placement breakdowns. If you do a kind of a Google search, you won't find it unless you know the kind of authors of the article that you might be looking for. Yeah. But, I did manage to find some information, and what you tend to see is that children where placements break down compared to children where children are maintained at home, but it's very difficult. The difference tends to be children who are placed into adoption later, who've had more changes of carer prior to arriving in adoption, even if those placements have happened, often, quite a large number of years before the actual adoption's broken down. So if you look at those, children where they're at home, but it's very difficult, versus children where they've moved out, those groups are fairly clearly separated on age. So the average age at entry to care in the left home group is 3.8 years, versus 2 years in the at-home group. So you can say, okay, these are children who've been exposed to more trauma for longer, most on balance of probabilities. Age at placement with the adoptive family. So the children maintained barely at home, average age 3.5 years. Age at placement with the adoptive family for placements where the children have left the adoptive placement, 5.4 years. I mean, it's a 2-year difference. So what we know really is that kind of, if you want to say reparative or corrective care, the earlier you can start that process, the more helpful, supportive, and impactful it can be, which is not to say that for kids who've had really adverse early experiences, there's no hope. But what it does mean is that almost the scales are more heavily weighed against progress, the less time you have in children's early years to intervene. And there's a I don't know if you remember the kind of was the program called 7 Up? It was like
Yes.
the principle of which being shown. I think the kind of the hook line was, "Show me the child at 7, and I will show you the man." And now, if you watch that, it's an amazing resource. If people have had the chance to look at that, you actually see there isn't the predictive kind of value of how a child's doing at 7 is quite helpful, but certainly not perfect, and certainly not certainly it's subject to change. But as a kind of basic rule of thumb, there is a kind of there is a pretty solid principle that in terms of intervening through parenting, you've got a fairly limited window. And I suppose I think of it from a clinical point of view, because working with parents has been a very large part of my clinical work over the years, and specifically running parenting groups and developing parenting groups. The evidence base for parenting groups is that up to the end of primary school, roughly, so around the age of 10, parents and families are children's main social determiner. So that's the kind of place where you intervene, because you've got leverage there. Once children go into secondary school, their primary, or to some extent, their primary social focus shifts to peers. And so working through parents becomes very much more difficult and much less effective. And the evidence on outcome data is, if you do parenting groups with secondary school age children, parents feel empowered and more confident, but you can't measure behavioral or emotional changes in the kids. So hopefully that gives a whistle-stop tour of how I'd view that anyway.
A lot of the cases that involve breakdown involve evidence that the parents, whether they're adoptive or SGOs, that they may have been too rigid, they may have been too strict, they may have been too punitive, or in the alternative, they might have failed to put boundaries in place to these already traumatized children. They might have been collusive or dismissive. Often at the point that they relinquish the care of the child, they're accused by local authorities of abandoning the child. How important is it to separate the consequences of early trauma on the child's development with the consequences of their carers not being able to cope with them later on?
I mean, I'm not sure that you meaningfully can separate those things, if that makes sense. I mean, I mean, at least my perspective would kind of be that those things are kind of inextricably linked. That once a child has laid down a foundation of a certain set of expectations, they are quite likely to view whatever sort of care they get through the lens of those expectations.
Yeah.
And we quite often see, parents or, substitute carers, so whether they're adopters or special guardians or foster carers, being drawn into patterns of care that replicate in often quite surprisingly close ways, replicate some aspects of the care that children have experienced prior to being placed. And you could say, well, again, I mean, that sounds like it might be implying those children are to blame for that, but I certainly wouldn't see it that way. But there's almost a sense of, if the children are expecting a certain response, they may be quite skilled at eliciting a response that for them, although it may be aversive, because it's familiar, there's also a kind of comfort to it, if that makes sense.
It does.
The other thing that I would say I mean, two other points I suppose I'll make, which maybe over answering your question, but one would be to say that I think the system in terms of safeguarding kids, social care system, tends to be quite prone to look for blame and wrongdoing, because actually that's a very large part of their responsibility, is to identify where things are going wrong. And so I kind of think that perhaps, unfortunately, there's a tendency to be looking to see whose fault is this, and to look for a kind of a goodie and a baddie. And obviously the tendency when we're working with children is to say, well, the child must be the goodie, so the parent carer is probably the baddie. It's a bit oversimplistic and black and white, and I suppose that sometimes the family court system, being found kind of foundationally adversarial, also tends towards a kind of that sort of predisposes that system to looking towards blame as well.
Can I interrupt you for a moment?
Yes.
In the case of Re-K that I mentioned earlier, the psychologist in that case made the following observation. He said, the trouble with the legal process surrounding orders, etc., is that they're predicated on events being someone's fault. Either the parent failed or the child is too bad. It is unhelpful to the therapeutic process. Since the legal process exists, the challenge would be to explain to the child in a way which is helpful to them why the court makes the finding that they do. Is anything in that comment that resonates with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the whole thing's very well put.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
the reason it's not that, again, that's not intended to be a criticism of the legal system. It's more that sometimes I have the feeling that the family court is, sometimes the family court doesn't feel like quite the right tool, if you like, to manage the difficulties that can arise in families. Although it can be extremely helpful in a lot of circumstances.
I think most practitioners would agree with that observation.
The other thing, George, that I was wanting to say was that, because you started the question that I was answering in a fairly rambling and long-winded way, was about, you were saying, sometimes often it's identified that parents have acted in ways that are too boundaried, unboundaried, in ways where the parenting they've provided perhaps has been suboptimal, certainly for that child and meeting their needs. And I think one of the things that's quite important is to identify that actually the impact of parents or of adopters on caring for children who've got a very, very high level of need in itself is very high. So the kind of outcome study that I looked at, which is from 2014, but it's a very comprehensive study, found that around a quarter of the parents of kids who had left home had symptoms of moderate to severe depression and anxiety. And although the parents of children who were maintained at home had somewhat higher levels of anxiety, they had lower levels of depression. And in the it says here, which is what I found quite shocking, 13 of the 35 parents in the left home group had symptoms that indicated they were likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder. So I kind of think there's something that where it's quite easy to overlook the fact that actually these breakdowns, happening as they often do over several years, have a really profound effect on the adults involved as well as on the children involved. And it's I'm certainly very mindful in this discussion that if you're a child who's been adopted out of an already traumatic and difficult family, where your sense of attachment and security to start off with is compromised, that the breakdown of an adoption after several years is going to be devastating often for those young people. At the same time, we have to hold in mind that it's very often devastating and emotionally very destructive for the adults involved who have been often doing their best in very difficult situations to provide the care a child needs.
What do you think the clinical consequences are, in your experience, of focusing too much either on fault or blame when looking at a case where even if the child has suffered from trauma, we focus too hard on the failings of the parents to be able to provide that reparative care? What are the consequences of focusing on blame in those situations?
Well, I mean, I think the truth is it's quite unhelpful. the study looking at the breakdowns identified that of the three causes cited by parents, adoptive parents for breakdowns, two of them were lack of support from professionals and being blamed by professionals. And the third one is difficulties with the child's behaviour. So, what tends to happen is if you're dealing with parents, adoptive parents of children where the placement fails, predominantly stay involved with those children in a supportive parental role, even if the child's no longer living at home, so that relationship doesn't finish when that child moves out of the house. If those teenagers move, there's still an ongoing level of support. Now, if you're dealing with a very fraught, very challenging, highly emotional situation where that relationship is quite unstable, if you're saying legally, we want to say this parent is to blame for this breakdown, the risk is that what actually happens is the parent withdraws from that child and the child loses a source of support, however compromised it may be in some ways, that could be immensely valuable in the years to come. And the other thing that I hold in mind quite often is when we're working, I work a lot with the family court, and I've also worked for the children in care team down in Cornwall for a number of years. I did work for them, and a lot of that was around placement breakdowns, but more fostering. Now, if you're looking at a family at the point of breakdown, it's very tempting to say this has been a failure. But you can't really judge success and failure at that point. You probably need to look at when the child's 25 or 30. Beyond that point, where would they be absent the support they've had during those years of being in an adoptive placement and with the support they've had beyond? Is that better than they would have been doing had they not had that support and had they been somehow maintained in a difficult adverse home situation, or have they been in a fostering placement? Does that kind of make sense? So I feel that one of the difficulties with this sort of discussion is how, if we're looking at a single time point, we probably are not looking back far enough in time, because what we're talking about normally is transgenerational trauma, where children are being raised by parents who are effectively traumatized children who have been themselves raised by traumatized children. Normally going back, at least several generations. And then we're looking at a point of breakdown where you can't really judge the success of a young person's upbringing at the age of 14, 15, 16, when they might be moving out of a placement earlier than they should be. Really, we need to look into the 20s or even early 30s to have some sort of sense of the stability a young person may have achieved. Does that make sense? And not that I'm expecting the court to be able to project into the future quite at that level.
I think it's helpful to take that perspective. I think if I, though, return somewhat to being devil's advocate, ever since Lord Justice Wall cited Philip Larkin's "This Be the Verse" back in 2009 in a High Court judgment, I've always been intrigued by why it is that parents find it so hard within proceedings to accept the second limb or second verse line of that poem. We're on a seminar, so I'll say they mess you up, your mum and dad. They don't mean to, but they do. If some harm has already come to a traumatized child from the parenting they've received after being traumatized, I think what a lot of local authorities find difficult to get to grips with is why shouldn't you say so? Why shouldn't you say, look, I know we can't necessarily separate out the initial trauma from the what happened afterwards, but if we're going to take accountability and put that into the therapeutic process, unless you have some level of accountability, you can't really then enter the therapeutic process. Is that a fair observation?
Oh, well, George, I like the comment of your colleague. I hope I'm not getting her name wrong. Claire
Ciborowska. Yep.
There you go. So she concludes, in the opinion of the writer, it's unhelpful for any court to be invited to look for blame, whether this be blame of the parents or blame of the child. For many parents, the conclusion the child's beyond parental control will already be a difficult conclusion to deal with. And I think that's a pretty solid conclusion. It says the focus should be on how the child can be helped and protected. And so my view would be that although although in a therapeutic conversation, there would quite often be grounds for saying, okay, let's look at what's gone wrong and what you might be able to do differently and more positively next time. We have to kind of remember that people, when we're looking at children who've got quite severe attachment difficulties, providing what they need from a parenting point of view is very difficult and far from intuitive. So you've often got parents who are using strategies that would be effective with other kids, and that really would are not in themselves inherently harmful, but who perhaps entrench in certain strategies under the pressure of a very difficult parenting situation to the point where they become difficult and sometimes emotionally damaging. But again, I mean, and maybe I'm being a bit inflexible on this, but my kind of view is that if you're looking at a kind of permanent document that the child and the parents could go back to in terms of a legal judgment, that what's the word? Is it encapsulating blame into that ruling? In my view, has the risk of being damaging and alienating and undermining relationships rather than supporting, this focus on this is where we are now. How should the child be helped and protected going forwards? Does that make sense? And I wouldn't view the apportioning of blame as a necessary precondition for therapeutic change. What I would say is that a conversation around mistakes, responsibilities, change that might be needed, if it's possible to have one of those conversations without being unduly blaming, that provides a very good springboard for change. Does that, and then again, I'm back, I suppose, to what I was saying at the beginning, that we're talking about a slightly different landscape when we're talking about therapeutic or psychological intervention with these families versus a legal outcome. And I always wonder whether the second limb, is that what it's called?
Yes.
Parental control. I almost wonder whether that has been formulated almost with the idea of avoiding blame, in that you could say, in some cases, okay, this child is beyond parental control because of neglect or because of parental substance misuse. So, I can think of a number of cases where I could see cases I've worked with where the children are very clearly beyond parental control, but you've got a very clear neglect or abuse pathway to that. Now, in those cases, it's very clear where the responsibility lies. It's a parent whose own trauma is so severe that they can't be available for the child in the way the child needs them to be. But if we're looking at that limb of beyond parental control in and of itself, I do wonder whether it's formulated to be able to sidestep that issue of blame. That's a total conjecture, and it may be
it's not. I was going to say it's not conjecture, because I think that in reading out the guidance to the Children Act Volume 1, as I did at the beginning, the guidance seems to say clearly that it is formulated. As I said, it's immaterial whether this is the fault of the parents of the child. I think one of the questions, and you've partly addressed it in the answer you gave, is this: if we remove blame and fault, and I don't think there are any practitioners who would think that it's helpful to use terms like blame and fault or even culpability from care proceedings, from these sorts of cases, is it still necessary for there to be accountability? So you might formulate it as it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. I mean, essentially, can we affect change in parents if that's one of the outcomes we want, if we can't get the parent to take responsibility or to be accountable for their bit?
Well, I'm thinking about parenting, working with parents and in parenting groups. One of the almost the first thing that we look at when we're getting a group of parents together is it kind of speaks to this question, really, which is a kind of we would kind of do an exercise which looks at what are the different factors that lead to a child presenting in the way that they're presenting. I'm thinking of particularly kind of young children with behavior problems or with anxiety difficulties. And we'd look at a kind of matrix of, environmental, child-related, historical, and parent-related factors. And, normally, probably between a quarter and a third of factors that parents bung in do relate to parents. But then when we look at the number of factors that can be impacted, we might be looking at 60 to 70% of those factors can be impacted. And in any group, what you'll find is that the agents of change, if you ask parents to identify who can make a difference, it's always those in the parental role who are the ones who are equipped to make a difference. So there's something about saying to parents that some of these things may be to do with your own circumstances or your own choices. Most of them aren't, but you're the people who have the capacity to change these things. So I like what you said really about it's, you may not be to blame, but you are responsible for moving things forwards. And I do think that if you have, and I can think of families I've worked with clinically where they've said, well, my teenager's behavior is impossible. And unless they do X, Y, Z, we can't go forwards. And I, in those cases, would say very clearly, your teenager isn't going to do that because they're a child.
Yeah.
That, the X, Y, Z has to come from you in the first instance. If you actually want things to be different, you're going to have to be the one to step up to the plate, however difficult that might be. And that's not to say your teenage behavior is acceptable and you should put up with, abusive behavior or bad behavior or things that break the rules you have in your house. But if you want change to come from the child, you're likely to be waiting, beyond that child's timescales, I would say. So does that answer your question properly?
I think it does. I think one of the things that I find striking, and I'd recommend to any of the people listening or watching to go and look at ReK in particular, if you have a case where you truly believe that the child is beyond parental control and the parent involved or the carer involved really doesn't have a great deal of culpability. Because what the psychologist says is, and Ben, I'd like some observation from you if I can. He says that parents get caught in a vicious circle where their normal behavior, which works with most children, often only serves to further alienate the child in their care. And to call these uncommon parental reactions emotionally abusive is not only inappropriate and wrong, but cruel. The vicious circles that the parents and their child got into are seen in many families with insecure adopted children, where well-intentioned efforts to help the children and structure their behavior and protect them only lead to the child becoming more resentful, alienated, and angry. It's really the comment where he says that to call the responses emotionally abusive is not only inappropriate and wrong, but cruel. Would you go that far? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, that's not to say that there aren't some cases where people might behave in ways in which, adopters may behave in ways which are obviously emotionally abusive. But I do think there's again, it almost comes back to that idea that there's a certain kind of professional approach which looks to make a case by labeling things as emotionally abusive or harmful. Because of the nature of the adversarial system, really, that I think is unhelpful and certainly can be immensely damaging for kind of professional relationships and actually family relationships. And I think often when you're working with cases where things really have broken down in adoption, it's very unusual in my experience for that to be for that to happen unless adopters have really tried.
I think if
I can think of a couple of cases that I was involved in where adoption broke down very, very quickly, like within weeks. And in those cases, I remember thinking, I remember feeling quite angry myself that I felt as though the adopters had not really given the sibling group a fair chance. Now, I wasn't in that house, so I don't know what it was like, but those are very unusual cases in my opinion. I do get some information from Coram, who said that their figures suggest that 2.2% of adoptions break down pre-adoption order, which you might say that's still a fairly high number if you look at absolute numbers, but it's certainly smaller than the numbers that break down post-adoption. And the post-adoption breakdown is nearly always during the teenage years. And what we know is there's quite good post-adoption support in those first months following an adoption. But in most local authorities, the general, the kind of publicly available, unless you fund it privately, provision for adopters during teenage years is next to non-existent.
Yeah.
And that's the point where we look at the data, that's where it's probably most obviously needed.
Finally, I think as we're getting to the end, practically, if you get sent a request to do an expert assessment, do you need a finding if the child is beyond parental control that there is some culpability or some inference that there is also parental failing? Or is that something which, as a psychologist doing an assessment, you're simply going to pick up as part of your assessment anyway? So in other words, it's not necessary for the court to do that exercise for you as a professional seeing the carers to be able to determine that conclusion in any event.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'd rather reach my own conclusion on that point anyway. Yeah. Although if the court's, if the court's made a finding, I'd obviously work with the finding the court's made. But I feel like I quite often feel that in some ways the most helpful way of engaging with one of those assessments is to start off with reasonably little information and do one's own assessment, and then pull the background information together and kind of cross-reference that against what one's seen oneself in the assessment. So I like to certainly have a clear idea of the kind of structural history and what's gone on. But I find that if I read too many different people's reports prior to meeting with people, it's harder to keep an open mind. Although I'm not suggesting that all of my colleagues who do the same work would have the same approach. I suspect that's quite idiosyncratic in terms of people having different ways of viewing that.
I think, in fact, that the reason I asked the question is that it strikes me that if you make a finding that the child is beyond parental control, it's almost axiomatic that to a greater or lesser degree, there is some parental contribution. And ultimately, the whole point of this discussion is to work out how useful it is and those circumstances in which we need to really investigate that. Before I go, I can't help but put one last quote to you and get some feedback. It might be the beginning of another seminar, but this is what the psychologist Enrique said about the letter of instruction that was put to him. He said, many of the questions that I had were lacked, many focus on methodology, but in such a simplistic way as to verge on the pointless and aggressive. Others are superficial, over-evaluative, or simplistic. In considering some questions, I'm disappointed by the poor quality, imprecision, lack of focus on content, and at times offensiveness which characterizes them. If you are getting letters of instruction, do you ever find yourself feeling similarly about the way that cases such as this are put before you?
I'd say that's quite an extreme response. Or I didn't see the letter of instruction, obviously. I mean, what I think is I think that for practitioners, writing letters of instruction is probably quite an anxiety-provoking process. And people want to make sure they've covered their bases, and also obviously want to make sure that they're asking questions in a way that hopefully will get the information out which is to their client's benefit. And I've got a lot, often the kind of consequence of that can be that we get letters of instruction where the same or very similar questions are asked from slightly different perspectives, but in a way where one finds oneself saying, I've already answered this, question 6 in my answer to question 2B. So there can be, and I think there is a kind of variable quality of letters of instruction, to be honest. I mean, I would tend, if there was a point where, if there were questions that were very difficult to answer, I would tend to go back to my instructing solicitor and say, look, I'm going to struggle to give you a helpful answer on these ones. Do you want to go back to whoever put those in and ask whether they might like to rephrase them? But to be honest, it's fairly rare. I think there's people, approach that process normally in reasonably good faith and ask questions that are sensible. And I think while practitioners might have some anxiety about getting the questions right, we often have our corresponding anxiety about getting the answers right and putting those in a way that are going to be helpful to practitioners and meaningful. And one of the things I suppose is that the court likes to deal in certainties, and as psychologists we like to deal in them in areas of grey, really. So there's a there's sometimes a just a professional mismatch from the ground within which we operate, really. But yeah, I would I think writing, there's always scope when you're working between different professions for misunderstanding. And so one of the examples that sticks in my head, when I was in Salford, we used to run clinical supervision for people who'd been helping to run our parenting groups. Now, from a psychology point of view, supervision means it's a supportive space where you talk about your own experience of clinical work, anything that's been triggered for you, how you might improve things to deliver a better service for people. We had social workers co-running with us, and apparently it turns out, I've discovered after about 2 years of inviting social workers to supervision, that supervision in social work world means you're going to get told off for making a mistake.
Yeah.
So it wasn't an appealing invitation. And I kind of think that that same thing applies when we're working interdisciplinary wise between legal practitioners and experts in different fields. That actually we have we're a bit like the Americans and the British, that we're divided by a common language, if you like.
Well, perhaps it's an appealing invitation to you to come back and help us with a psychologist's view on how to properly draft letters of instruction. But I think for now, Ben, can I just thank you very much for taking part in this webinar. I'm afraid that we've run out of time for questions, so any of those that I've got in the chat we'll respond to by way of email. But Ben Laskey, thank you very much for joining me. I've already mentioned, you're welcome. If you are watching the recording and have any further questions, then please email them through to events@42br.com. The recording will be available online. You can watch it through the YouTube channel. And if I can just take this time to say that the next webinar in the series will be on Thursday, the 27th of June from 5 p.m. Gemma Taylor, KC, and Anne Osborne will explore the duties of local authorities to notify parents and foreign authorities of proceedings, to disclose papers within proceedings to parents, how and when those duties can be discharged, limited, and the procedure for applying to restrict or discharge a local authority's duties to notify or provide disclosure. Thursday, the 27th of June. And if I can thank, as well as Ben, all of those of you who have attended, thank you very much for turning up and giving us your time this afternoon. Goodbye.